Orders, Commander.
How many times must I tell you? Mind the nerdish cap!
We are...
I'm Jay.
I'm Dante.
And this is Mind the Nerdish Gap. Okay. All right. So today, looks like my son Dante here is going to ask a few questions as well of me. We'll kick off with your questions.
Okay. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was, as a kid, kind of going into our generational conversation, did you expect to see or have any kind of like, I guess, dreams essentially of like the progression of technology and like how much has occurred within your life? Like, was there, as a kid, was there like something that you had in mind as to like where we would be this day and age, and like kind of how that compares to where we actually are?
Wow, interesting. I didn't think about your question quite that way when you pitched it to me. As far as technology, I think we're probably really close to where I envision things to be. Especially with all the wireless technology, a computer in your hand and things like that. I think transportation-wise, I think is the biggest thing that probably my generation thought we'd be further along on. I literally thought by this time we'd have, floating cars and stuff like that. So I think that from that aspect, we didn't evolve as quickly as I imagined. But as far as just compute and stuff like that, definitely, my wildest dreams, I never thought, especially, think about the watch. If you think about the watch and how it's still, it's almost as powerful as your desktop computer, but it's on a watch.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the joke that, we'd have something like that. So it's amazing that came along. When you were talking about this earlier, I was focused more on like movies and the technology used to do movies and things like that. And I even did a little research, and it was interesting because I think it was the mid 80s before the first movie that really did their special effects purely on a computer. It didn't necessarily go well. It was The Last Starfighter, I think is what it was. And what it was is it was still kind of a fallout from studios trying to replicate Star Wars, but trying to figure out ways to move away from practical, oddly enough. And so they kind of went that direction, and I still think at times, clearly, the computer stuff still doesn't quite make the mark. And I'm a big fan of, if you can do it practically. Oh yeah. I really think that's going to be the best way to go. So I still think the technology still has a long ways to go in that aspect. But I think Marvel's pulled it off, quite a few times. DC's actually pulled it off a few times and everything. Both of them had their failures as well, even recently. But compared to what we had growing up, it's still night and day difference. So even their failures are 1,000 times better than their best stuff that we saw back in the day. So
it's interesting because like I like that because like for me, I had technology kind of introduced to me at like such a young age, and like some of the things that I was seeing like be done through like CGI or like visual effects. It like when I was younger, there was a part of me that like was like heavily imaginative in the idea of like when I saw Star Wars when I was younger, for example, I like was just convinced in my head that like someday this is where we're gonna be. Like someday we're gonna be flying around in starfighters out in space. Like, and I was just like, it's so interesting to think about how that perception has changed, because like even for you, for example, it's like you thought of like flying cars, and I thought of spaceships, right? Like how it's scaled up over time, and it's very interesting to me how that's kind of occurred. But yeah, so then moving on to my next question, what is your favorite genre for a media form? Or like a genre that you feel like you couldn't get tired of. So like, for example, fantasy or sci-fi or...
Yeah, so to me, I think it is sci-fi, and I think the main reason is I feel sci-fi can fit into so many different buckets. So you can have sci-fi comedy, you can have sci-fi action adventure, you even have a sci-fi twist on a fantasy story, right? Definitely sci-fi horror, which is, you know, quite a bit done and everything like that. So I think there's just so much that sci-fi can cover that it'd be really hard for me to feel that there'd be a point where I'd be disappointed or you know, tired of the sci-fi genre, just because I feel it's just the most flexible.
Yeah. I agree with that. It's so hard for me because like when presented with those two genres, I feel like those are like both fantasy and sci-fi. I feel like those are ones that are kind of one and the same for me, that like I just couldn't get tired of them. Kind of because of what you're saying, where it's like there's so much flexibility and moldability within those genres that like it just feels like there's always something that I haven't seen that pertains to that genre. Right. And it's heavily intriguing to me in that factor that like there's always a different take and there's always like a different way to approach that genre, like what you're saying.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, so for me, you know, fantasy and sci-fi. I'd also kind of throw like historical fiction in there too. Oh wow. Just because I really like someone being able to world build something that is completely foreign to anything we know, right? So like even like I feel like Star Wars is kind of a good example in this of like showing how things that maybe we have a slight understanding of in our own world and our own reality, how this stuff would work or how it would function in a completely different like society, essentially, right? Like
different history and morals.
Yeah,
and
exactly. And I feel like that goes into historical fiction. I could be wrong about that.
Well, I think I see where you're going, because it's something where you've built a rich history for it. Yeah. Right? You've built this canon of materials that you're broadening from, and you not necessarily expose everything of that, but it's there. So then you can tap it at different times and stuff like that. Exactly. So yeah, I can definitely see that. Kind of along the same lines, what I like is when they take actually true historical events and then do a twist on them. Yeah. What if this one thing changed, and then what would be the course of history from that point? Right?
Yeah, kind of like butterfly effect.
Exactly, like the butterfly effect. You know, like the Watchmen did a really good job of that, with Nixon staying in office and everything, and then things changed because of that, and then you had the introduction of superheroes and all these different type of things that happened just because these simple events changed in the timeline. Yeah,
that's really cool.
All right, cool. So questions for you. What is your weirdest horror film experience? Both maybe on screen or off screen. What would you say was your weirdest horror film experience?
Well, so on screen, I feel like my strangest like horror experience was probably when I watched Terrifier 1, the first Terrifier film. Right. That movie, for whatever reason, I don't think I'd ever seen a movie before that when the movie ended, I was just sitting there staring at the screen like,
what just happened?
Yeah, like I was just like so dumbfounded. And I don't think that like there's been another horror movie that has really done that to me. I mean, there's been movies where like horror films where like what's being communicated is like up for heavy interpretation, right? To the point where like you don't really understand what you just saw after immediately watching the movie.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's different from what Terrifier did, because Terrifier was like, I just saw something that I felt like I shouldn't have seen.
Oh,
right?
no.
Like it felt like I just saw like something that like kind of
It should not have been legally presented. Wow.
Well, maybe not that, but like just that it had a very kind of grungy, real quality to it. Of like, this almost felt like some like snuff film that like some serial killer filmed, right? Like that was kind of the level. Now with the first film, I feel like it hits the most in that way. The second film, it just skyrockets into like obscene territory of like the stuff that is happening in the film. So like, and I feel like if you've already seen the first movie, you go into that one like kind of expecting like
a certain level.
Yeah, but when you see that movie for the first time and you haven't seen Damien Leone's other work and like you're just jumping into that, it's like, what the hell, man? What did I just watch, dude? But then out of film, like outside of watching a movie, I feel like, at least still kind of in the sense of a movie affecting me, I feel like when I first saw The Grudge, for whatever reason, like that movie, it didn't really freak me out as much while I was watching it, but then like it like creeped me out with like every single scenario that like The Grudge could possibly show up in, like in my real life, right? Like I'd be looking at dark corners differently. I'd be like having nightmares about it. Like it was really weird how watching the movie wasn't that crazy, but then everything I experienced outside of the movie that my brain just came up with was like freakier than the movie.
Yeah, see, I can really sympathize with that. So Jaws for outside the movie did that to me. So it was interesting. So I saw Jaws, and at the same time, Carol Burnett's show had this thing where the shark was in the pipes and would get you to the toilet. And then Saturday Night Live had this land shark thing where he'd knock on the door, and then you'd open the door and he'd get you. So my brain combined the real Jaws movie with those skits.
Oh no!
And I was terrified of the toilet for a while. The shark, and then like every time there was a closed door and I hear it knock, I'm like, the shark's behind the door. So that's what my brain did outside the movie. But watching a movie, my weirdest experience watching the movie, I think I probably told you about this, but I was such a big Hellraiser fan when I saw it that I decided, and so here, just a little background, my grandparents are both big horror film fans and everything, and I'd always go to these movies, like I went to Cujo and Jaws and stuff like that with my grandmother, right? So for some reason, I decided for like a Sunday afternoon with my grandparents to sit down and watch the Hellraiser movies. And I had them sit through both of those movies, and it didn't even occur to me till much later. It's like, what the heck was I doing? It's like, I get that they love horror films and everything, but I think I think it would be like you sitting down with your grandparents and having them watch Terrifier, and they'd probably be like, I think the boy needs help. I think we need to call 911. They never said anything, and they sat through both the movies, and there was like no commentary afterwards, which is a good indicator that they probably didn't enjoy it. But I think they were probably thinking, yeah, he's lost it. He's definitely lost it. All right, so going into our normal agenda, so the current nerding, so movies and TV, I kind of want to talk about live action versus animation. Especially, like they got the new live action, happening. Oh gosh, now I can't even think of the thing of it. The one with the earth, fire, water, air.
Avatar.
Avatar. So they're doing a new live action. If I understand correctly, they're doing a live action one with the same original cast, but they're also doing an animated one with the original characters as well. And I'm not sure, but I'm pretty confident that the animated one they're older, but I think the live action one, they're older as well. Have you heard anything about that? So what are your thoughts as far as, especially animation? Because I know translating comics to live action, especially in art right now, seems to be working out for the most part pretty well and everything. The animation is not as strong with the comics, but taking actual animated content and then taking it to live action from the animation. What are your thoughts?
I think that when it works, it really works. So like a good example of this is one of the things that when we were discussing Ahsoka earlier, one of the things that I had described to you was like how it felt so much more. It felt the flashback sequence of going back into the Clone Wars with her.
Oh yeah.
It made the point of Jedi being like child soldiers. Like it made that point hit so much harder because you see what is like the closest thing to what we connect when we see a child in real life to like a child in this universe, right? Like it was the closest equivalent of that. And I feel like in moments like that, it really, really works, especially for people that point didn't really land home for when they were watching the animation. Because I feel like when you're doing an animation, like especially when it comes down to like the style of it, there can be points like that don't really communicate themselves fully, right? Like when you're watching the Clone Wars in animation, it feels like Ahsoka is older than she actually like canonically is in those moments
in that cartoon,
right? And so when you see that like put into live action, it's like, whoa, she is way smaller, like way younger, like her face just gives child, right? And so it's like that communicates way more. And I feel like those are really good moments for it when it has like a definitive purpose like that.
Oh, I didn't think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, but like it's hard when there's not really much of a purpose behind it besides just like, oh, we're taking these characters from this animated thing and making them live actors. Like when there's not like a deeper thing than that, I feel like that's when it kind of struggles.
Right.
But when there's like a thematic element that's there
that really hits home because it's live action.
I feel like that's when it's like a really good use of that, a really good utilization of that. But otherwise, I mean, like that's not to say that I like one or the other more usually. Like for me, it's weird. Like I feel like I don't mind live action stuff as long as it's not trying to do things that could be communicated way better in animation.
Yeah.
And I don't mind animation as long as it's not trying to do things that would be communicated way better in live action.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think historically I felt that if it was done successfully as an animated feature, then I think leave it alone. So I really struggle with like the Disney remakes, Lion King and Aladdin and all that stuff. It just doesn't, it's hard for me to watch those. It doesn't really hit home for me the same way. In fact, sometimes it feels like the emotion or heart of it's completely gone with the translation of live action. But your Ahsoka example is a really good example, and maybe that's part of it because they're not really adding value. It's almost like they're just trying to re-get your bucks again, right? And so that's, I dig that. I like that. All right, so let's go into our next category. The Boys Gen V we keep talking about. So latest episode. So again, I guess spoiler warning because it just happened, but by this time you should have seen it. But Kate's redemption arc and the whole team bonding exercise. So what did you think of that?
I really wasn't expecting that. So one of the things that intrigues me a lot by what they did with that is that I'm seeing like more and more connections to the like, you know, the Boys universe and like characters that we've met from the Boys within the show. So like I'm really intrigued to learn if Kate or Rufus have any sort of relation to Mindstorm. So I don't know if you remember Mindstorm from season 3, but
Right.
like he was the guy that put Butcher basically like into his own like entranced like,
Right, and
sleep
he went through
world.
his whole background.
And he went
everything.
through his whole background,
Right.
kind of similarly to how with these characters in this episode, we saw memories that were their own,
Right.
as opposed to being a memory that Kate would
had.
have.
Right.
And so that's one thing that like I'm really intrigued by, and I don't know if they're going to elaborate any further on that, but I feel like it would kind of add up like timeline wise if one of them or both of them maybe were
Somehow
Mindstorm's
connected.
kids.
To Minds- I think more likely it'd be Rufus than Kate. Yeah, but that's an interesting theory and everything. I thought the Soldier Boy cameo was pretty awesome.
It was funny. It was great.
The most important thing I need to tell you, and he's just gone.
That's like your classic like
Right.
horror movie moment of like,
it's
the
like-
character that has all of the knowledge is about to spit some truth and then they get
gone. But it also makes me wonder if somehow Kate's affinity for Soldier Boy, I'm wondering if they used her as part of the way to control Soldier Boy currently. So I'm wondering if there is going to be some kind of tie back there. So that'd be interesting. The Dean. So I think she just wants to kill Soups.
Oh yeah.
I
oh
think
yeah.
that's all
After,
she wants.
After that episode, I'm
Right.
convinced that she just
Soups
full
gone.
blown. Yeah, she just wants to go full blown genocide on them.
On the
And
Soups.
Now
yeah.
the thing with that though is that I feel like her and Cardosa are really opening Pandora's box here, and I don't think they're realizing like the shit they're getting themselves into, because as soon as Vought or the boys find out about this, like they're both gone. Like
Right.
I'm not convinced that their characters
Right.
are surviving.
Right, yeah, it's going to be very interesting what's going to happen. I'm not convinced either, but I think Cardosa is going to be the one that's going to go first, because I think she's going to get, as soon as he validates his results and makes it contagious like she wants,
Yeah.
she's going to get rid of him,
Yeah.
right? Because she doesn't want a cure, so she doesn't need the person who created it,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
She wants to make it, contagious, and then he's gone. I don't think he even knows. She's like, make it contagious. It's like, as soon as you do that, dude, you're dead. You are so dead.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't want a cure.
Well, and there's almost something like in the actor who's playing Cardosa, there's like in his performance you can kind of tell that there's like after the point that he's killed the soup, he is extremely hesitant, especially after the point that Shetty like tells him make it contagious. It's like you can see the look on his face. He's like, man, what did I get myself into? Like, what did I just do?
I wonder if he's going to be trying to bone out and be like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Dude, it's going to be bad. All right. I wasn't going to talk about horror, but we'll kind of go into a little more of the quick takes here, I think. So I think, and I wish you'd start watching Loki because we could talk about that.
I do need to get caught
Right.
up. I'll do that for next time.
But I think that there are examples out there of genre that are trying to do course corrects and trying to fix some things that maybe they didn't quite do as well. What are your thoughts? I mean, like, I know, James Gunn being in charge of DC. What are your thoughts around that? Do you think that he can actually get DC going right, or do you think the one-off films are probably the best bet that they've had?
I think it depends, right? So like I've kind of been of the mind for a while that DC really needs to like kind of break off and do their own thing. Like they need to stop trying to like follow
cinematic
trying
universe
to make
thing.
it the Marvel thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know if like I don't know if their solo films will keep up enough of I'm trying to think of like how to word this. I don't know if their solo films will keep up like enough continuity for like fans to latch on to now. like it's just weird because of the state that things are in. Like we have this mix up of they've already kind of tried to do the DCEU with Zack Snyder and everything, and that's kind of, you know, gone with the wind. And like they've had success with their solo films, but the issue is that one of the main critiques I see come out of those solo films is I wish this was connected to some deeper universe.
Right, actually broaden from there, right?
Yeah, and so that's part of the problem is that like I almost feel like they've written themselves into a corner where it's like if they try to just break off and do their own thing, you're still going to have unhappy people because they're going to want something that's more connected and more broad. But then, you know,
every time they try to connect, if they don't do it just right, it's not going to work still. And so that's like the thing for me it's hard to determine. But I feel like, in my opinion, I've probably enjoyed the like solo standalone films the most. Now, I wouldn't mind those standalone films getting sequels, but does that mean that they develop into like a deeper cinematic universe? Right, kind of going into your thing about having a history and really broadening from there. And
right,
stuff too.
Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge, and I've said this time and time again, I think unfortunately Christopher Nolan broke DC. I think his success with his Batman movies set a precedent that DC thought, well, this is the way to do it. And so they try to fit everything into this dark and gritty thing. So even when they brought Zack Snyder on, who was kind of the king of kind of the dark and gritty, that's what mostly he's done too. And they basically said to him, we're going to let you create this whole cinematic universe, but just take your lessons from Christopher Nolan, who actually worked with him on Man of Steel. So then they made, to start off their cinematic universe, they made the first hero out of it, dark and gritty, who is the most bright and shiny superhero in DC Comics. So it's like, and I think that's the challenge, is I think DC has a tone issue that they can't figure out a way to get a balance, like you said. Figuring out the tone from dark and gritty Batman to the bright and shiny Superman, which that should be the story. Doing the juxtaposition between those two should be what the story that you're telling. But, I mean, angsty Superman was pretty much like Batman with powers, which was probably not a good thing. You know, and as much as I enjoyed the movie for the action and everything like that, the fact that he put a truck on a telephone pole and everything, that's not what Superman would do. And that's the fear. That's what would make people not join around him and not want to be a part of him because... And The Boys does a pretty good job with that. It polarizes people, so you're going to have some people that are just really afraid, and some people are like, yeah, that's what you should do, instead of just unifying people, which Superman's always been about, is unity. So I think that's my biggest struggle with that. I think for the most part, Marvel's done a pretty good job of figuring out that kind of middle ground tone. Lately, granted, they've been kind of more goofy.
Yeah, more comedic, yeah.
And I'm not sure why they went that way, but like I said, if you watch Loki, you can see that they can start stepping into the darker stuff. There's some really dark stuff in the latest episode, and it's like, I would have never thought Marvel would go there. It's dark, it's creepy, but yeah, I think that's it. So, but it looks like our time is kind of coming to an end and everything. So, Dante, sir, again, thank you for joining me. This is number 3. Number three. We got 3 under our belt.
All right.
Making progress. So I think we're getting better and better. The backdrop will probably change every week. We'll see. We'll figure out something. But at any rate, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week on Mind the Nerdish Gap. Okay.
Orders, Commander.
How many times must I tell you? Mind the nerdish gap!
We all